When it comes to image quality, as amazing as phone cameras can be, they still cannot compete with dedicated hardware. Even old cameras from a decade ago can run rings around any phone no matter how advanced that phone might be. And that's because of the differences in sensor size and glass. I've already done 2 videos about the subject, pitting the iPhone 11 and 13 Pro against a very old Micro Four Thirds camera, the Panasonic GF1. Despite its 13 years of age, this tiny little camera can outperform both the 11 and 13 Pro. But how about the iPhone 14 Pro? Can the GF1 compete with Apple's latest and greatest sensor advancements? Let's find out. I think the first thing we need to cover is file formats. Picking the wrong one will have a big impact on image quality. On the iPhone, we have 3 choices. At the very bottom is the high efficiency or JPEG format. I would say avoid this one at all costs, not because of the compression used, but because of all the image tweaking that gets baked in. Apple is being very aggressive with sharpening, noise reduction, and other ways to artificially enhance the image. So when we save a photo as a JPEG, we also bake in all these adjustments. And there's absolutely no way to revert back to a normal looking image. Then there's ProRAW. This format also bakes in a lot of Apple's adjustments, but it's way more flexible than a simple JPEG. We can adjust the exposure and the colors of the image, the color temperature, and the overall sharpening of the image. If we had only these 2 options to pick from, I would always recommend using ProRAW. But despite its flexibility, ProRAW is still a flawed format, and that's because of enhancements like night mode still getting baked into the image. By far, the best format and the one I would recommend always using is RAW. With RAW, nothing's baked in, and as a result, we have a very natural looking base to build on. But I know what you're thinking. You don't want to always edit your photos, and sometimes you just want a quick snap for social media. That is still possible. With third-party programs like Halide, we can easily save an image in both formats, high efficiency and RAW. So we can quickly post the high efficiency format without having to do any edits, but we also have the digital negative to adjust and fine-tune at some later point. And depending on the app, there's no extra data management required. Halide automatically saves the image in the Photos app. And on top of that, the Photos app automatically manages duplicates, so the JPEG and RAW images will show up as one. Now that we have that sorted, let's start comparing images. This is one of the most uneven of comparisons, but since the iPhone includes macro photography in its feature set, we might as well test it out. The GF1 has the advantage of using interchangeable lenses, so we can pick a lens specific to this task. This 60mm lens can produce the equivalent of a 2x image magnification on 35mm cameras. This lens alone is a third of the cost of the iPhone. As you can imagine, the phone is already at a disadvantage. The iPhone doesn't have a dedicated macro lens at all. The wide lens doubles as a macro. And from the very first photo, the differences are immediately obvious. The GF1 can produce a detailed image throughout the frame. The edges are as crisp as the center. The iPhone, on the other hand, is crisper in the center, but that doesn't say much. Even the center is not really detailed. The chip, or whatever that part is, has a small scratch that doesn't even register on the iPhone. But it's not just small details. The GF1 image holds a lot more details overall. We can even see the slight texture of the PCB board. The most extreme differences, though, can be seen on the edges of the frame. The GF1 perfectly describes all the details of the screw. We can clearly see the texture and even the tiny scratches on it. On the iPhone, on the other hand, everything is blurry and out of focus. It's worth noting here that this is not motion blur from my hand as I'm taking the photo. I've used my watch to snap the picture. This is just the wide lens trying its very best. And keep in mind that with the GF1, I could go even closer, but I didn't do it because I had to match the iPhone's frame. Here's how much closer I could actually go. So yeah, there's no competition here. which in turn makes certain type of photography impossible to do with the iPhone. For example, here's a typical macro shot of some tiny little flowers. With the GF1, we can separate the foreground from the background. We can easily get a nice, moody image with a lot of depth of field and definition. With the iPhone, something like this is just impossible. I gave up trying to match the composition because no matter how I frame things, I wouldn't be able to get the GF1 image. The iPhone photo looks more like a behind-the-scenes look of how the actual image was shot. I tried once more with a different composition just to see if there was a way to create an interesting image by shifting things around, but as you can see, the iPhone can't beat a big sensor and a very fast lens. What's interesting is that if I wanted to, I could also blur things even further on the GF1, separating the flower from the background even more, but then I would have to use focus stacking due to the very shallow depth of field. Here's a couple more macro images just so you can see the differences between the two cameras. I think it's clear that macro photography is not the iPhone's strong point. Let's now test something less demanding. And here's where things get really interesting. As long as there's enough light, the iPhone performs at the same level as the GF1. There are some small telltale signs that give away the iPhone, but you have to know what to look for. Let's take as an example this image. It's really hard to tell which is which. The detail in both images is the same. The stop sign looks almost identical, and the same goes for other parts of the image, like the foliage or the other huge road sign. The colors on the iPhone are a little bit muted compared to the GF1, but that can easily be fixed by adjusting the saturation. On the GF1 we have some very rich blues and greens. I'm not sure though why we're seeing these big saturation differences. It could be some limitation with the iPhone sensor or something simpler like Adobe's RAW converter not yet supporting the iPhone 14. Whatever the case may be, I'm just going to disregard this because it can easily be fixed. Now let's check an image with differences that are a little bit easier to see. At a glance, the images look almost identical, and I'm happy that they're this close. These types of images are the bread and butter of an iPhone. If we disable the noise and color noise reduction, it's obvious that the iPhone image is noisier. I don't think it's going to be easy to see on YouTube, but here on my screen it's quite visible. I think if we go to a darker part of the photo, it'll be easier to tell. There's a lot of color noise here, which is a little bit unfortunate because I'm using a very low ISO value. More specifically, ISO 80 for the iPhone and ISO 100 for the GF1. I was hoping the performance would be a little bit better. The one thing though that is a little bit more worrying is the loss of detail in the LED sign. As you can see, both letters and numbers have artifacts. The detail is not fully resolved. I think this is the point where we probably reach the limits of the iPhone's tiny sensor. I don't think it's just a fluke or something wrong with the way the image was captured because we'll see this exact issue in more images later on. But despite these issues, the GF1 and iPhone images are very close. The GF1 has a slight advantage, but it's nothing too extreme. Now, let's go back to the saturation issue we saw earlier in an image that clearly showcases the differences in saturation. Again, I think it might have to do with Adobe's RAW converter and not the iPhone, but I'm just showing you everything so you have a clear idea of what's going on. So here's how the images look with the colors tweaked to match. Both look almost identical, even under close inspection. The details are almost the same, and I have to look for specific things to tell which camera is which. Let's now take out all the color adjustments and you'll see how different the colors are. The iPhone image has very muted colors. Again, it's easy to fix, and it's probably Adobe's Camera Raw doing something raw. But yeah, when I first saw the images side by side, the differences took me by surprise. Now, let's check the iPhone's low light performance. Both images were shot with the camera's default ISO setting. ISO 100 for the GF1 and ISO 50 for the iPhone 14 Pro. The color temperature is different, but that's my fault. I actually forgot to adjust that when I was taking the picture. But aside from that, the images are very close. The photo coming from the iPhone looks very clean and natural, and holds the same amount of detail as the GF1. With an asterisk, but before I show you why I'm saying that, let's compare the iPhone's RAW image with the iPhone's high efficiency format, just to convince you to never ever use that format. As you can see, Apple just goes wild with the sharpening and noise reduction. The night mode image just looks incredibly wrong. The RAW image on the other hand looks very natural. And the nice thing with a RAW file is that if we want to sharpen the details, we can do it without any problem. In the end, we have a better looking image that can also be fine-tuned at any point. Now, let's go back to our comparison with the GF1. As I've mentioned already, the details look very similar until we zoom into the text of the book. As you can see, the GF1 resolves all text details. We can clearly read through the whole page. On the iPhone, on the other hand, we have a lot of these red artifacts. If you recall, we saw a lesser effect of these artifacts on one of the daylight images. That was disappointing to see, but after a bit of testing, it turns out that these artifacts are caused by the long shutter speed. In order for me to shoot at ISO 50, I had to increase the shutter speed to iPhone's max. That's 1 second. I guess there's some light leakage between the photodiodes of the CCD or something of that sort, because the lower the shutter speed goes, the fewer artifacts we will get. Here's the same image shot at ISO 800 and 1/25th of a second. Sure, the image is noisier and there's less detail, but there's almost none of this artifacting showing through. If we look closely, there's 3 areas where we can see these artifacts, but other than that, the image is clean. So there's something going on with the sensor when we use these long shutter speeds. Could it have something to do with Adobe's Camera Raw? In this case, I don't think that's the issue, because the closer we go to this 1 second shutter speed, the more artifacts we see in the image. And that's when I decided to use the 48 megapixel Pro RAW just to see if I could get any more detail on the text. And it turns out that yes, we can get more detail. This image is shot at ISO 1000 and at 1/25th of a second. If we ignore the extremely aggressive noise reduction, it's clear that more text detail is captured. If we reduce that image to 12 megapixels, we do get clean text, but because of all the aggressive noise reduction, we still have less detail than the GF1. The floorboards, for example, are represented as big, patchy areas of color. But on the GF1, we can clearly see the patterns of the wood and other small details like scratches. I just wish we could grab a 48 megapixel RAW photo instead of a Pro RAW. If we could do that, I think the iPhone would be able to beat the GF1, but as it stands now, the 13-year-old 12 megapixel GF1 beats the all-new 12 megapixel iPhone 14 Pro. I was also very impressed with the performance of the telephoto lens. In previous phones, the quality of the image captured with any other lens other than the main one would suffer greatly. But this year, the telephoto lens performs really well, at least at default ISO values. The iPhone image is shot with a default ISO 20 and the GF1 with ISO 100. The GF1 still has a cleaner and less noisy image, but I definitely did not expect this result from the iPhone. I was used to my iPhone 11's super noisy telephoto images. As a last test, I decided to check the ISO performance of both cameras, just to see how well the iPhone performs. The GF1 was notoriously bad at high ISOs. Anything higher than 400 was really pushing it. But still, we're talking about a bigger sensor, so in theory the GF1 should perform better. And it turns out that is true. At ISO 400, the GF1 shows a minimum amount of noise. By the way, in order to evaluate the noise, I've turned down all noise reduction settings. But keep in mind that if we enable noise reduction, the images won't look as noisy. At ISO 800, the GF1 starts getting a bit noisier, but it's still at a nice level. The iPhone is quite a bit noisier, but I would say it's still passable. At ISO 1600, both cameras get very noisy, but the GF1 holds up a lot better than I expected. It's quite noisy, but it's still workable. The iPhone is even noisier, but both images will look much better in real life because of the noise reduction we can apply. Considering how tiny the iPhone's sensor is, the results are really good. Overall, I'm extremely impressed with iPhone 14's performance. At default ISO values and when shooting RAW, we can get some great images out of it. Even though it still cannot beat a 13-year-old camera, I feel we're getting closer. And if at some point third-party applications allow us to shoot 48 megapixel RAW, I think things will get even closer. Highlight gives us this option in preferences, but once we enable it, the app just crashes. So for now, we're limited to 12 megapixel RAW files. Now that I've seen this level of performance, I will definitely snap more pictures with my phone. Hopefully with next year's iPhone or the one after that, we will be able to beat the GF1. But until that happens, this 13-year-old camera is still the winner. Take care, and I'll see you on the next one.